In the quiet logging town of Cedar Falls, Oregon, Dr. Elise Garner has seen her share of wounded strays. But when a silent, trembling dog appears at her veterinary clinic's doorstep on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening, she has no idea that this routine examination will uncover something that defies explanation. As she probes a festering wound in the animal's front paw, something moves beneath the infected tissue, something that shouldn't exist in any textbook she's ever studied. What emerges is alien, insect-like, and very much alive. Within hours, her lab contact goes silent, the sample disappears, and pets throughout Cedar Falls begin exhibiting behaviors that chill her to the bone. But what truly terrifies Elise isn't just the creature itself. It's the growing realization that this parasitic nightmare may be connected to her estranged father's decades-old research, and that she might be the key to either stopping it or unleashing something far worse. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. The morning after the stray dog incident, Dr. Elise Garner sat in her office at Cedar Falls Veterinary Clinic, staring at her leather-bound medical journal. The pages, normally filled with neat, methodical case notes, now bore hasty sketches of something that shouldn't exist. She traced the outline of the creature she'd drawn from memory's segmented body. 6 legs, mandibles that had clicked with an almost mechanical precision. Outside her window, the town of Cedar Falls was waking up to another ordinary day. The logging. Trucks would begin their rumble down Main Street within the hour, carrying Douglas fir and cedar toward the mills in Portland. Mrs. Henderson would arrive at the diner by 6 to start the coffee and prep the breakfast special. Sheriff Barnes would make his first patrol around the school zone before the children arrived. It was the kind of predictable rhythm that had drawn Elise back home 5 years ago, seeking the comfort of familiar routines after her residency in Seattle. "Dr. Garner?" Martha's voice carried from the reception area, along with the familiar chime of the front door. "Your first appointment's here early." Martha Fleming had been the clinic's receptionist for 12 years, long before Elise had taken over the practice from Dr. Whitman. At 62, she possessed the rare combination of unflappable composure and genuine warmth that made anxious pet owners feel immediately at ease. Her gray hair was always perfectly styled, her reading glasses perpetually perched on a beaded chain, and her desk organized with military precision. "Send them back, Martha. I'm ready." Elise closed the journal and slipped it into her desk drawer, though she couldn't shake the image of those clicking mandibles from her mind. Jake Morrison appeared in her doorway, leading Mrs. Patterson and her ancient golden retriever, Buster. At 26, Jake had been her veterinary assistant for 2 years, and his easy smile and gentle manner with animals made him invaluable to the practice. He'd grown up in Cedar Falls, the son of a logging foreman, and had discovered his calling during high school when he'd volunteered at the local animal shelter. "Morning, Doc," Jake said, helping Mrs. Patterson guide the arthritic dog onto the examination table. Buster's been limping again on his back left. As Elise examined the dog's hip joint, feeling for the familiar signs of progressive arthritis, Mrs. Patterson chatted about her garden, her grandchildren's visit next month, and the unseasonably warm weather they've been having. It was the kind of gentle conversation that usually grounded Elise, reminding her why she'd chosen this life over the frantic pace of emergency animal hospitals in the city. But today, her fingers moved differently across Buster's fur, more deliberately, searching not just for inflammation, but for anything unusual. Any small wounds, any sign of infection, any indication that the creature from last night wasn't an isolated incident. "His joints looking good considering his age," she told Mrs. Patterson, adjusting the dog's arthritis medication dosage. "The glucosamine supplements are working well. Just keep him on the same routine." After Mrs. Patterson left with Buster moving more comfortably on his adjusted medication, Elise found herself thinking about routines, how they provided structure and meaning. How they could also blind you to changes happening right under your nose. Her own routine had been carefully constructed after the rift with her father. Dr. Raymond Garner had been a brilliant entomologist, respected in academic circles for his research on parasitic species and their evolutionary adaptations. Elise had grown up surrounded by his work specimen jars lining the shelves of his home office, field notebooks scattered across the dining room table, late-night phone calls with colleagues discussing emergence patterns and life cycles. As a child, she'd been fascinated by his passion. He would take her on collection trips through the forests around Cedar Falls, teaching her to observe the intricate relationships between parasites and their hosts. "Everything in nature has its purpose, Elise," he would say, crouching beside her to examine a fungus growing on a fallen log. "Even the things that seem destructive are part of a larger pattern." But fascination had turned to frustration during her teenage years, as her father became increasingly obsessed with what he called impossible research, theories about parasitic species that didn't match known classifications, emergence patterns that defied conventional wisdom, and evolutionary jumps that seemed too rapid to be natural. His colleagues had grown skeptical, then dismissive. Funding dried up. The university suggested he take early retirement. The final break had come during his senior year of high school, when she'd found him in his office at 3 in the morning, surrounded by maps and charts, muttering about preparation cycles and family genetic markers. When she'd asked him to explain, he'd looked at her with eyes that seemed to see something she couldn't, and said, "You wouldn't understand yet. But someday you'll need to know. Someday you'll be the one who has to act." She'd chosen veterinary medicine partly as a rebellion against his obsessions, a practical, grounded profession focused on healing rather than studying the mechanisms of invasion and control. She'd gone to college in California, completed her residency in Seattle, and returned to Cedar Falls only after Dr. Whitman's retirement had created an opportunity too good to refuse. For 5 years, she'd successfully avoided thinking about her father's work. His letters went unanswered. His phone calls declined. She'd heard through Martha, who knew everyone's business in a town of 3,000 people, that he'd moved to a cabin on the outskirts of town and continued his research in isolation. Now, staring at the sketches in her journal, she wondered if her father's impossible research might not have been so impossible after all. The morning proceeded with its usual mix of routine checkups, vaccinations, and minor procedures. Jake moved efficiently between tasks, preparing examination rooms, comforting nervous animals, and maintaining the easy banter that kept the atmosphere light. But Elise noticed him glancing at her more frequently than usual, and she realized she must be projecting her own tension. During their lunch break, she found him in the small staff kitchen, heating up leftover soup and checking his phone. "Everything all right, Doc?" he asked, not looking up from his messages. "You seem a little distracted today." Elise considered how much to tell him about the previous night's discovery. Jake was steady, reliable, and genuinely cared about the animals they treated. But he was also part of a close-knit community where unusual events quickly became common knowledge, and she wasn't ready for that level of scrutiny. "Just tired," she said, pouring herself coffee from the pot that Martha kept perpetually brewing. "That emergency last night threw off my sleep schedule. Right, the stray dog. Martha mentioned it when I got in this morning. She said you stayed late to patch it up." He looked up from his phone with concern. "Everything okay with the little guy?" "She's fine. Wound was more superficial than it looked initially." The lie came easier than she'd expected, but it left a bitter taste that had nothing to do with the strong coffee. The afternoon brought Mayor Tom Collins to the clinic, not as a pet owner, but in his official capacity. A man in his 50s with the practiced smile of a career politician and the handshake of someone who'd worked his way up through local business before entering public service. Collins had been instrumental in securing the economic development grants that had helped modernize Cedar Falls' infrastructure over the past decade. "Elise, I hope you don't mind the interruption," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd known her since she was a teenager. "I wanted to talk to you about the animal control situation. We've been monitoring." She felt a chill of apprehension. "Animal control situation?" "Sheriff Barnes mentioned you've been seeing more strays lately, and we've had some reports of unusual pet behavior around town. Nothing serious," he added quickly, "but enough to warrant attention. Aggressive dogs, cats going missing, that sort of thing. We want to make sure we're staying ahead of any potential public health concerns." Elise chose her words carefully. "I haven't seen anything that would constitute a public health emergency. Stray animals are always more common in warmer weather, and pet behavioral issues usually have straightforward explanations." Collins nodded, but she could see calculation in his eyes. Cedar Falls' economy depended heavily on its reputation as a safe, family-friendly community. Tourism from Portland brought in significant revenue during summer months, and several tech companies had recently considered relocating satellite offices to take advantage of the area's quality of life and proximity to outdoor recreation. Of course. I'm sure you're handling everything appropriately. But if you do notice any patterns, anything that might suggest we need to implement preventive measures, I hope you'll let me know immediately. We've worked too hard, building our community's reputation, to have it undermined by preventable problems." After Collins left, Elise sat in her office feeling the weight of competing obligations. Her professional responsibility was to her patients and their owners, but she was also part of a community that trusted in her expertise and judgment. And somewhere in the background of her thoughts, her father's voice echoed with warnings about preparation and patterns she wasn't yet ready to understand. The last appointment of the day was with Sheriff Tom Barnes and his German Shepherd, Rex. Barnes was a man who'd grown into his authority over 2 decades of law enforcement, first as a deputy and then as sheriff for the past 8 years. He commanded respect through competence rather than bluster, and his presence in the clinic always made Elise feel like the community's safety net was functioning as it should. But today, Rex seemed agitated, panting heavily and repeatedly pawing at his own neck despite Barnes' attempts to calm him. "Started this morning," Barnes explained, keeping a firm but gentle grip on Rex's leash. "He's not responding to commands the way he usually does, and he's been scratching at that spot until it's raw." Elise examined the irritated area on Rex's neck, finding inflamed skin but no obvious cause, no embedded ticks, no signs of contact dermatitis, no indication of an allergic reaction. The dog's temperature was slightly elevated, and his pupils seemed dilated despite the bright examination room lighting. Has he been anywhere unusual recently? New hiking trails, different food, exposure to other animals? Same routine as always. Morning patrol around town, afternoon training session, evening walk through the neighborhood. Nothing out of the ordinary. Barnes paused, studying Rex's behavior with the same analytical eye he brought to investigating minor crimes. Though now that I think about it, there have been more reports of lost pets this week than usual. Mrs. Chun's cat didn't come home Tuesday night. The Richardsons' lab mix got out of their yard yesterday, and old Mr. Foster called about his chickens. Acting strange. Elise prescribed a mild antihistamine for Rex's skin irritation and recommended monitoring his behavior for the next few days. But as she watched Barnes lead the still agitated dog out to his patrol car, she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had accompanied her father's most disturbing discoveries. That evening, after Jake had gone home and Martha had locked up the front desk, Elise remained in her office, staring at the sketches in her medical journal. The creature she'd drawn seemed to stare back at her, its mandibles frozen mid-click. its segmented body suggesting a horrible efficiency of design. She thought about her father's warnings, Mayor Collins' concerns, and Sheriff Barnes' casual mention of unusual animal behavior throughout the town. She thought about the reliability of patterns and how sometimes the most important truths were hidden in details that seemed too small to matter. Finally, she picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized years ago but never called. The phone rang 6 times before switching to a generic voicemail message. No personal greeting, no indication of who might eventually listen to the recording. "Dad, it's Elise. I think I need to understand what you were trying to tell. Mammy, there's something happening here. Something I can't explain with anything I learned in veterinary school. If you get this message, please call me back. I'm ready to listen now." She hung up and sat in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the familiar smells of antiseptic and animal fur, listening to the clinic settle into evening quiet. Outside, Cedar Falls was transitioning from day to night with its usual peaceful rhythm, unaware that somewhere in the shadows, something alien and patient was beginning to stir. The call from Dr. Sarah Chun at Oregon State University's biology lab came at 7:30 the next morning, just as Elise was unlocking the clinic's front door. She'd been checking her phone obsessively since leaving her father a voicemail, but his number had gone straight to a recording stating the line was no longer in service. "Dr. Garner, I've been trying to reach you since yesterday evening." Dr. Chun's voice carried an urgency that immediately set Elise on edge. "About the specimen you sent for analysis, we need to discuss this in person." Elise stepped into the clinic's reception area, switching on lights as she moved toward her office. "What did you find?" "I can't discuss specifics over the phone. How quickly can you get to the university?" "Dr. Chun, I sent you that specimen because I trust your expertise. If there's something unusual about it, I need to know what we're dealing with." A long pause filled the line, and when Dr. Chun spoke again, her professional composure had cracked slightly. "Elise, in 15 years of parasitology research, I've never seen anything like this. The cellular structure doesn't match any known classification. It appears to be synthetic engineered rather than naturally occurring. But that's impossible given the biological complexity." Elise sank into her desk chair, staring at the preserved specimen jar she'd prepared the night before. The creature inside had been perfectly still when she'd sealed it, but now it seemed positioned differently. Its mandibles oriented toward the jar's opening, its body curved as if poised to spring. "Where did you say you extracted this from?" Dr. Chen continued. "A stray dog's paw wound. Deep puncture, probably from stepping on something sharp in the woods." Elise moved closer to the jar, studying the creature's positioning. "Dr. Chun, hypothetically, if this were some kind of engineered organism, what would be the implications? Hypothetically? If someone had the technology to create parasitic organisms this sophisticated, they'd have capabilities that don't exist in any legitimate research facility I know of. We're talking about biological engineering decades ahead of current science." As Dr. Chun spoke, Elise watched the creature in the jar. It definitely wasn't in the same position she'd left it. The preservation solution should have killed any remaining biological function within hours. Yet something about the organism's posture suggested awareness, intention. "I'm driving down to see you this morning," Dr. Chun said. "Don't discuss this with anyone else until we've had a chance to examine the specimen together. And Dr. Garner, if you encounter any other animals with similar infestations, don't attempt extraction procedures. Call me immediately." After ending the call, Elise spent several minutes studying the specimen jar, trying to convince herself that the creature's apparent movement was a trick of light and shadow. But when Jake arrived for his morning shift, she immediately moved the jar to a locked cabinet in her office. "Morning, Doc," Jake called from the reception area, where he was going through the routine of preparing examination rooms and checking supply inventories. Martha left a note that Mrs. Patterson called Buster's doing much better on the adjusted medication. That's good to hear. Elise forced herself to focus on the familiar rhythm of morning preparations. How's your schedule looking today? Pretty light until this afternoon. Though I did get a weird call last night from my neighbor, Mr. Harrison. He wanted to know if we do house calls for livestock. Elise looked up from organizing her examination instruments. Livestock? Harrison doesn't have livestock. That's what I thought, but he said his chickens have been acting strange since Monday. Won't come out of the coop, making noises he's never heard before. When he tried to check on them yesterday, they attacked him, drew blood on his arms and hands. The tightness in Elise's chest returned with renewed intensity. Chickens don't typically exhibit aggressive behavior toward their owners, especially not coordinated attacks, right? I told him to call us this morning to set up a proper evaluation. Jake paused in his supply check, studying Elise's expression. Doc, is everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Before she could answer, Martha's voice carried from the reception area where she was arriving for her shift. Jake, honey, can you help me with something? I've got Mrs. Rodriguez on the phone, and she's pretty upset about her cat. Jake headed toward the front desk while Elise remained in her office, staring at the locked cabinet containing the specimen jar. 3 separate incidents in as many days: Rex's agitation, Harrison's chickens, and now Mrs. Rodriguez's cat. In a town the size of Cedar Falls, that pattern was impossible to ignore. Martha appeared in her doorway, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the expression she reserved for particularly challenging situations. Mrs. Rodriguez's cat, Luna, came home yesterday with what looks like bite marks on her back legs. But here's the strange part. The wounds are perfectly round, about the size of a pencil eraser, and they seem to be getting larger despite the antibiotic cream Mrs. Rodriguez has been applying. Getting larger how? She says the tissue around each puncture is turning gray and spreading outward. Luna won't let anyone touch the area, and she's been hiding under the bed since yesterday afternoon. Martha sipped her coffee thoughtfully. I scheduled her for this morning, but Mrs. Rodriguez sounded genuinely scared. Sighed, Luna's never behaved like this before. An hour later, Elise was examining Luna Rodriguez while Jake held the normally docile Persian cat steady on the examination table. Mrs. Rodriguez, a retired teacher who'd lived in Cedar Falls for 30 years, stood nearby wringing her hands and providing a steady stream of worried commentary. She's always been such a gentle cat, Mrs. Rodriguez repeated for the 3rd time. Never scratched anyone, never hissed, never caused any trouble. But yesterday, when I tried to look at those wounds, she scratched me so badly I needed bandages. The wounds on Luna's back legs were unlike anything in Elise's experience. Perfectly circular punctures, approximately 8 millimeters in diameter, surrounded by tissue that had indeed turned gray and appeared to be expanding in concentric rings. The affected skin felt different under her examination, gloves harder. Somehow, as if the cellular structure was changing at a fundamental level. But it was Luna's behavior that truly disturbed her. The cat's pupils were dilated despite the bright examination lighting, and she seemed to be listening to something beyond human hearing, her ears twitching and rotating toward sounds that weren't there. Mrs. Rodriguez, has Luna been anywhere unusual recently? Outside areas she doesn't normally visit. She's always been an indoor cat, but she got out Monday evening when I was bringing in groceries. I found her Tuesday morning sleeping in my garden shed. That's when I first noticed. She was acting strange. Monday evening, the same night the stray dog had appeared at the clinic. Elise carefully cleaned the wounds with antiseptic, noting that the gray tissue didn't respond to the solution the way healthy skin should. Instead of the expected inflammatory response, the affected area seemed to absorb the antiseptic without any visible reaction. I'm going to prescribe a stronger antibiotic, she told Mrs. Rodriguez, but I want to see Luna again in 2 days to monitor the progression. If the wounds Don't start improving, or if her behavior becomes more concerning, call us immediately. After Mrs. Rodriguez left with Luna secured in her carrier, Elise sat in her office documenting the examination while Jake prepared for their next appointment. The similarities between Luna's wounds and the stray dog's injury were impossible to dismiss, but the implications were too disturbing to process rationally. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Chun. Equipment malfunction at lab. Analysis delayed. Don't let specimen out of your sight. Elise checked the locked cabinet, confirming that the specimen jar was exactly where she'd left it. But as she studied the creature through the glass, she realized with growing horror that it had definitely moved. Not just shifted position, but appeared to have grown slightly larger, its segmented body more defined, its mandibles more prominent. The preservation solution, designed to halt all biological processes, seemed to have had no effect whatsoever. That afternoon, Jake returned from Harrison's house with news that confirmed Elise's worst fears. The chickens weren't just acting aggressively, they were exhibiting coordinated behavior that defied everything known about poultry psychology. They arranged themselves in a defensive formation around the coop's perimeter, and when Jake had attempted to examine one of the birds, the entire flock had moved as a single unit to block his access. "Doc, I've been around farm animals my whole life," Jake said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "What I saw this morning wasn't normal animal behavior. It was like they were following some kind of plan." Elise looked from Jake to the locked cabinet, thinking about the creature that seemed to be thriving despite chemical preservation, about Luna's expanding wounds, about Rex's agitation and the growing list of animals exhibiting inexplicable behaviors. She thought about her father's voice on old answering machine messages, warning her about preparation and patterns she wasn't ready to understand. "Jake," she said quietly, "I need to show you something. But first, I need you to promise me that what I'm about to share with you stays between us until we understand what we're dealing with." He nodded, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern as she unlocked the cabinet and withdrew the specimen jar. The creature inside was definitely larger than it had been that morning, an unmistakably alive dot as they stared at the impossible organism. Elise's phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. Chun's number, but when she answered, she heard only static punctuated by what sounded like equipment alarms in the background. Then the line went dead. The drive to her father's abandoned cabin took Elise through 15 miles of winding forest roads she hadn't traveled in over a decade. Jake had insisted on coming with her after witnessing the specimen's impossible vitality, and now he sat in the passenger seat, studying topographic maps she'd found in the clinic's file cabinet. Maps marked with her father's careful annotations about geological features and animal migration patterns. "Your dad really did his homework," Jake said, tracing his finger along marked elevation contours. "Look at these notes about underground water systems and seasonal cave access. This isn't casual research. It's like he was preparing for something specific." Elise navigated another sharp curve, her hands tight on the steering wheel. "My father was always thorough, sometimes obsessively so. I used to think it was admirable, then I thought it was unhealthy. Now I'm wondering if he was the only one who understood what was really happening here." The cabin appeared through the trees, exactly as she remembered it, a modest structure her father had built as a retreat from university politics, a place where he could pursue research without the constraints of academic oversight. But as they pulled into the overgrown driveway, Elise realized the building had been modified extensively since her last visit. Solar panels covered the roof, a sophisticated radio antenna rose from the structure's north side, and heavy-duty electrical cables ran from a generator housing to what appeared to be a workshop addition. "Dr. Garner," Jake said quietly, "your father's been living off the grid, but he's been doing it with some serious technology. The front door was locked, but Elise found the spare key in the same hiding place her father had used when she was a child inside a hollowed-out section of a fence post, protected by a waterproof container. Some habits apparently never changed. Inside, the cabin had been transformed into a research facility that rivaled anything at the university. Banks of computers lined one wall, their screens displaying data streams Elise couldn't interpret. Specimen storage cabinets occupied every available surface, labeled with dates and coordinates in her father's precise handwriting. And covering the main wall was a detailed map of Cedar Falls and the surrounding forest, marked with colored pins and connected by string to create a complex web of relationships. Jake moved toward the map while Elise approached her father's desk, where she found stack after stack of field notebooks. The most recent entries were dated just 3 days ago, the morning after the stray dog's appearance at the clinic. "Elise, you need to see this." Jake's voice carried an edge of fear she'd never heard before. "This map is not just showing animal migration patterns. Look at the dates on these pins." She joined him at the wall, studying the intricate network of markings. Red pins indicated animal incidents, each labeled with specific dates and descriptions. Aggressive behavior, domestic cat, March 15th. Livestock disturbance, Harrison Farm, March 18th. Canine agitation, Main Street, March 19th. The pins formed a clear pattern radiating outward from a central point deep in the forest, with the dates showing a progression over the past 6 months. But it was the blue pins that made her blood run cold. They marked human incidents, each documented with clinical precision. Unexplained skin irritation, Carter family, February 12th. Sleep disturbances, Miller household, February 20th. Behavioral changes, adolescent male, Thompson residence, March. 3. Jake, my father's been tracking this pattern for months. Whatever's happening in Cedar Falls, it didn't start with that stray dog. It's been building systematically. She opened the most recent field notebook, finding entries that read like a countdown to catastrophe. March 19th. Emergence pattern accelerating. Beyond projected timeline. Host adaptation rate suggests external catalyst. Must warn E before secondary phase begins. March 20th. Phone service discontinued as planned. Lab contact compromised. Moving to final preparations. March 21st. Specimen containment confirms worst-case scenario. Colony establishment imminent. E must understand. This is not random infestation. This is targeting. Jake found a cabinet filled with preserved specimens, each jar labeled with collection. Dates spanning the past 2 years. The creatures inside were similar to the one they'd extracted from the stray dog, but showed clear developmental variations, some smaller and simpler, others more complex, with additional appendages and enhanced. Mandible structures. "It's like watching evolution in fast forward," he said, comparing specimens from different months. But evolution doesn't work this way. These changes should take generations, not weeks. Elise discovered a locked filing cabinet and found the juwelier key tape beneath her father's desk drawer, another childhood hiding spot she remembered. Inside were research papers that had never been published, correspondence with scientists whose names she didn't recognize, and government documents marked with classifications she'd only seen in movies. One file contained photographs that made her stomach turn similar parasitic infestations documented in small towns across the Pacific Northwest, each incident occurring approximately 25 years apart. The photos showed the same circular wounds, the same gray tissue spreading in concentric rings, the same behavioral changes in both animals and humans. "Jake, look at this timeline." She spread the photographs across her father's desk, organizing them chronologically. 1951, Millfield, Oregon. 1976, Cascade Heights, Washington. 2001, Pine Ridge, California. Each town experienced the same pattern of animal behavior changes, followed by human infections, followed by she stopped reading, unable to voice what the final reports documented. Town evacuations, population relocations, official explanations, involving industrial contamination or infectious disease outbreaks. But the photographs told a different story: communities that had simply ceased to exist. In the bottom of the filing cabinet, she found a letter addressed to her, dated 6 months ago. Dearest Elise, if you are reading this, then the emergence cycle has begun in Cedar Falls, and I am no longer in a position to protect you directly. Everything I tried to explain during your childhood, everything you thought was obsession and paranoia, was preparation for this moment. The organisms are not naturally occurring. They are engineered biological weapons deployed by entities whose goals we have never fully understood. They target specific genetic markers, focusing their most aggressive infections on individuals who carry particular DNA sequences. Our family line has been marked for 3 generations. You will find my research notes in the workshop. The frequency generator I've been developing is your only hope of destroying the colony before it reaches reproductive maturity. But you must act quickly once the secondary phase begins. The infection becomes irreversible. Trust your instincts. Trust your training. And remember that sometimes the most effective way to heal something is to cut away the infected tissue before it can spread. All my love, Dad. The letter included a small key and directions to a hidden panel in the workshop wall. Behind the panel, Elise found equipment that belonged in a science fiction movie, devices that hummed with electronic energy, screens displaying waveform patterns, and a central apparatus that looked like a combination of radio transmitter and medical scanner. Her father's technical notes described the frequency generator in terms she could barely comprehend. But the basic principle was clear. The parasitic organisms communicated through ultrasonic frequencies, and disrupting those frequencies could interfere with their coordination and reproduction. As she studied the device specifications, Jake called from the main cabin. Elise, we've got company. Through the window, she could see Sheriff Barnes' patrol car pulling into the driveway, followed by a second vehicle. She didn't recognize a black SUV with government plates. Her father's final note, written in pencil at the bottom of his letter, suddenly made terrifying sense. They've been watching our family for decades. Trust no one in official positions. The infection goes deeper than you realize. Elise grabbed the frequency generator's technical specifications and her father's most recent field notebooks, stuffing them into a backpack she found hanging by the workshop door. Jake, we need to leave, now. As they slipped out the cabin's back door and into the forest, she could hear Sheriff Barnes knocking on the front entrance, calling her name with what sounded like genuine concern. But the presence of the government vehicle suggested that her father's warnings about surveillance had been more than paranoid delusions. Someone had been tracking their family's research, and that someone had decided it was time to intervene. They made it back to town by taking logging roads that avoided the main highway, with Jake navigating using his childhood knowledge of forest trails, and Elise driving with the focused intensity of someone who'd finally understood the stakes. The old ham radio from her father's cabin sat on the truck's dashboard, its ancient technology somehow more reliable than their cell phones, which had been losing signal strength throughout the afternoon. At the clinic, Martha was waiting with news that confirmed their worst fears. The phone lines had been intermittently failing since noon. Internet service had become sporadic, and several townspeople had reported problems with their television reception and radio broadcasts. It's the strangest thing, Martha said, adjusting her reading glasses as she consulted her notes. The phone company says there's no equipment malfunction, and the cable company can't find any service disruptions. But Mrs. Patterson called from her landline to say her cell phone hasn't worked since this morning, and the Hendersons stopped by to ask if we were having communication problems too. Jake set up the ham radio in Elise's office while she reviewed the cases they'd seen over the past 3 days, correlating symptoms with her father's research notes. The pattern was becoming clear. The communication disruptions weren't random technical failures, but systematic interference designed to isolate Cedar Falls from outside contact. "Doc, I'm picking up emergency service chatter," Jake said, adjusting the radio's frequency dial. "Sounds like there have been similar communication problems in 3 other small towns across Oregon and Washington. All started within the past week." Elise felt a chill of recognition. Her father's historical research had documented the same communication blackouts preceding each documented outbreak. It wasn't just preparation for infection. It was preparation for containment. Martha knocked on the office door, carrying a cup of tea and wearing the expression she reserved for particularly troubling news. "I've been thinking about the animal behavior reports we've been getting, and I remembered something my grandmother used to talk about." She settled into the chair across from Elise's desk, her usually cheerful demeanor replaced by genuine concern. Grandma Fleming lived in Cedar Falls her whole life, born in 1923, died in 1998. She used to tell stories about what she called the burrowing, times when the animals would act strange. People would get sick with mysterious symptoms, and folks would just disappear from town without explanation. Martha sipped her tea, organizing her thoughts with the same methodical approach she brought to managing the clinic's appointments. "I always thought they were just old wives' tales, the kind of ghost stories every small town accumulates over the years. But Grandma was specific about the timing. She said it happened when she was about 12, so that would be 1935, and then again when she was in her 30s, which would be the early 1950s. Elise consulted her father's timeline, finding entries that matched Martha's grandmother's memories almost exactly. "Martha, did your grandmother ever describe the symptoms people experienced? Skin problems that wouldn't heal, nightmares that seemed too real, pets that stopped recognizing their owners. And she always said the worst part was how people would start acting different, not sick exactly, but like they were listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear." Jake looked up from the ham radio, where he'd been monitoring emergency frequencies. "That's exactly what we saw with Harrison's chickens. Coordinated behavior, like they were responding to signals we couldn't detect. The radio crackled with a transmission that made them all freeze. A voice, distorted by static but clearly official, was coordinating what sounded like a quarantine operation. ... Perimeter established at mile markers 7 and 15. No civilian traffic beyond checkpoint. Medical teams standing by for symptom assessment. They're sealing off the town," Jake said, his voice tight with realization. "Whatever's happening here, somebody's been planning the response for a long time." Elise gathered her father's research notes and the technical specifications for the frequency generator, spreading them across her desk. If the government was implementing quarantine protocols, they had hours at most before Cedar Falls became completely isolated from the outside world. "Martha, I need you to do something that might sound strange, but I need you to trust me. Call everyone you know who has pets, especially anyone who's reported unusual behavior in the past week. Tell them to bring their animals to the clinic immediately for emergency health screenings." "How many people are we talking about?" "Everyone, Martha. We need to examine every domestic animal in Cedar Falls before." Elise stopped herself, realizing how her next words would sound. "Before the infection spreads beyond containment. Before the secondary phase begins. Before we lose the chance to stop this." "Before what, honey?" "Before the communication systems fail completely and we lose the ability to coordinate a community-wide response." It wasn't the complete truth, but it was enough to mobilize Martha's protective instincts. Within an hour, she'd contacted half the town and scheduled emergency examinations for every pet owner who could reach the clinic before evening. The first wave of arrivals brought confirmation of Elise's worst fears. Rex Barnes still showed agitation and dilated pupils. But now Sheriff Barnes himself was displaying symptoms: a slight tremor in his hands, frequent touching of his neck where the skin looked irritated, and a tendency to pause mid-sentence as if listening to distant sounds. Mrs. Patterson arrived with Buster, whose arthritis medication had become completely ineffective. The dog moved with a stiffness that had nothing to do with joint inflammation, and his normally gentle temperament had shifted toward nervous aggression. The Hendersons brought their 2 cats, both showing the same circular wounds Luna Rodriguez had developed, along with behavioral changes that made them nearly impossible to handle safely. But it was the consistency of symptoms across different species that truly frightened Elise. Every infected animal displayed the same dilated pupils, the same aggressive coordination, and the same apparent responsiveness to inaudible stimuli. They weren't just sick, they were being controlled. Jake worked efficiently to document each case while Elise performed examinations that confirmed her growing understanding of the infestation's progression. The circular wounds weren't just entry points for parasitic organisms, they were communication nodes, allowing the creatures to coordinate their hosts' behavior across the entire infected population. During a brief break between examinations, she found Jake in the supply room, staring at a map of Cedar Falls he'd marked with the addresses of every infected animal they'd examined. "Doc, look at this distribution pattern. It's not random, the infections are concentrated around specific geological features. Underground water sources, natural cave formations, areas where your father marked unusual mineral deposits." She studied the pattern, recognizing the same strategic thinking that had characterized her father's research. The organisms aren't just adapting to their environment, they're choosing optimal locations for establishing their colony. Places with natural communication networks, geological features that amplify their frequency transmissions. The ham radio crackled again, this time with civilian chatter from surrounding communities. Reports of roadblocks, medical checkpoints, and official statements about precautionary health measures following unspecified environmental contamination incidents. Martha appeared in the doorway, her face pale with worry. "I just got off the phone with my sister in Portland. She says there are news reports about emergency responses in several small towns, but no details about what's causing the problems. The official statement mentions potential industrial contamination and the need for temporary population relocations." Elise felt the weight of her father's warning settling around her like a familiar coat. Population relocations. The same euphemism used to describe what had happened to the other towns documented in his research communities that had simply ceased to exist after their outbreak cycles reached critical mass. "Martha, Jake, I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible, but I need you to listen carefully and trust that I'm not losing my mind." She explained what they discovered at her father's cabin, a historical pattern of outbreaks and the engineered nature of the parasitic organisms. She showed them the technical specifications for the frequency generator at her father's notes about targeting specific genetic markers. "So these things aren't just random parasites," Jake said slowly. "They're biological weapons designed to eliminate specific populations while making it look like natural disease outbreaks. And they've been testing their effectiveness for decades, using small towns as experimental sites." Martha's voice carried the quiet fury of someone who'd spent her entire life protecting her community, only to discover it had been marked for destruction by forces beyond her understanding. As evening settled over Cedar Falls, Elise realized they had reached the point her father had been preparing for throughout his years of isolation and research. The frequency generator represented their only hope of disrupting the parasitic network before it reached reproductive maturity, but using it would require getting close enough to the colony's central nexus to deliver an effective transmission. According to her father's maps, that nexus was located deep in the cave system beneath Cedar Falls, the same underground network that had been providing the organisms with their communication infrastructure and allowing them to coordinate the systematic infection of the towns. Population. The radio transmitted one final message before the signal dissolved into static. All units maintain perimeter. Sterilization protocols authorized at 060 hours. Sterilization protocols. Elise understood now why her father had spent years preparing for this moment, and why he'd risked everything to leave her the tools she would need to fight back. They had less than 10 hours to save their town, and the only way to do it was to descend into the darkness where the enemy had been patiently building its strength. The geological survey maps spread across the clinic's main examination table revealed the true scope of what they were facing. Jake had used his knowledge of local topography to correlate her father's underground network diagrams with official county records, creating a comprehensive picture of the cave system that ran beneath Cedar Falls like a hidden circulatory system. Your father was right about the communication infrastructure, Jake said, tracing his finger along the marked passages. These tunnels connect every major infection site we've documented. The organisms aren't just living in isolated pockets. They've created a coordinated network that spans the entire town. Elise studied the deepest sections of the cave system, where her father had marked the probable location of what he called the primary colony nexus. According to his notes, this would be where the queen organism established her reproductive center, coordinating the infection cycles and directing the behavior of all subsidiary colonies. Martha returned from checking the clinic's supply room with an inventory that was both practical and sobering. We've got enough portable lighting for maybe 6 hours underground, basic first aid supplies, and some emergency food and water. But honey, I have to ask, are we really considering going down into those caves when there are government agents swarming around town looking for exactly the kind of people who would be foolish enough to do something like this? Through the clinic's front windows, they could see the reality of their situation. Official vehicles had been positioned at key intersections throughout Cedar Falls, and uniformed personnel were conducting what appeared to be door-to-door health assessments. The cover story about industrial contamination was providing justification for unprecedented federal intervention in a community that had always prided itself on independence and self-reliance. Martha, those agents aren't here to help us, Elise said, consulting her father's notes about previous outbreak responses. According to this research, the official protocol involves containing the infected population until the organism's complete their reproductive cycle, then implementing sterilization measures that eliminate all evidence of what actually happened. Jake looked up from his radio monitoring station. Sterilization measures? Population relocation, followed by controlled burns or industrial accidents that destroy the contaminated area. The other towns in Dad's research, Millfield, Cascade Heights, Pine Ridge, they don't exist anymore. Not officially, anyway. The weight of that revelation settled over them as they continued their preparations. They weren't just fighting to save Cedar Falls from a parasitic infestation. They were fighting to prevent their entire community from being erased from existence by a government that had apparently been managing these outbreaks for decades. There's something else, Martha said quietly, pulling a folder from her desk drawer. I've been thinking about what my grandmother told me about the burrowing, and I remembered that she kept a diary. I found it in my attic last year when I was cleaning out storage boxes. The diary, written in the careful penmanship of an earlier generation, documented the 1951 outbreak with the observational skills of someone who'd lived through genuine crisis. Martha's grandmother had recorded not just the symptoms and behavioral changes, but the official response and its aftermath. May 15, 1951. A government man arrived today claiming health emergency. Told everyone to gather at the school for medical evaluation. The Garrett family and the Washingtons refused to go, said they didn't trust the officials' intentions. Haven't seen them since. May 18, 1951. Strange sounds from the caves stopped yesterday evening. Animals acting normal again. Government. Men saying crisis is over, but they're still not letting anyone leave town. May 22, 1951. Fire at the old mine shaft. Officials claim accident, but Henry Morrison saw them setting charges. They're covering up whatever was down there. Don't think we were supposed to survive this. Elise felt a chill of recognition. Her father's research had documented similar accidents following each outbreak, fires, explosions, or building collapses that conveniently destroyed evidence of the parasitic colonies after their elimination. Grandma's final entry was dated June 1951, Martha continued. She wrote that 12 families had disappeared during the crisis, but the official records claimed they'd relocated due to health concerns. No forwarding addresses, no explanation of where they'd gone. Jake's radio monitoring revealed increasing chatter about perimeter security and biological containment protocols. The official timeline was accelerating, driven by factors they could only guess at. Perhaps the organisms were reaching reproductive maturity faster than expected, or perhaps the government agents had detected signs of organized resistance to their containment efforts. "We need to move tonight," Elise said, studying the cave system maps one final time. According to Dad's notes, the frequency generator will be most effective during the queen organism's reproductive cycle, which should begin at peak hormonal activity around midnight. Martha gathered their supplies with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades managing medical emergencies, while Jake loaded the frequency generator components into backpacks designed for extended underground exploration. The device itself was surprisingly portable. Her father had clearly designed it for fieldwork rather than laboratory use. As they prepared to leave the clinic, Elise took one final look at her medical journal, where she documented the progression of symptoms and behavioral changes they'd observed over the past week. The leather-bound book represented everything she'd learned about conventional veterinary medicine, but also her growing understanding that some problems required solutions outside the boundaries of traditional scientific training. "Doc," Jake said softly, "what if we're wrong about this? What if the government agents are actually here to help, and we're about to interfere with a legitimate containment operation?" It was a fair question, and one that had been troubling her throughout their preparations. But her father's research provided a clear answer. The historical pattern of outbreak responses, the systematic elimination of affected communities, and the complete absence of any public acknowledgement of the parasitic threat. Jake, if they were here to help, they would have contacted the local medical authorities for assistance and expertise. Instead, they're implementing isolation protocols and avoiding any interaction with people who might have actual knowledge of what's happening. Martha locked the clinic's front door and posted a sign indicating temporary closure due to family emergency, a small deception that might buy them additional time before their absence was noticed by the surveillance teams. They left Cedar Falls through the Forest Service roads that Jake knew from childhood hunting trips, using topographic maps to navigate toward the cave entrance her father had marked as the most direct route to the colony nexus. The underground journey would be dangerous, even under normal circumstances. But with infected organisms potentially defending their territory and government agents monitoring surface activity, they were essentially moving through a war zone where the front lines kept shifting as they hiked through the darkness toward the cave entrance. Elise found herself thinking about her father's final letter and his warnings about trust. Everyone in their small group was risking their life based on research they didn't fully understand, pursuing a solution that might not work, and fighting an enemy whose capabilities they could only guess at. But they were also fighting for something that transcended individual survival, the right of their community to exist, to make its own choices about risk and safety, and to preserve the accumulated wisdom and relationships that made Cedar Falls more than just a collection of buildings and infrastructure. The cave entrance appeared through the trees exactly where her father's maps had indicated, marked by geological features that suggested the underground system was both extensive and ancient. As they prepared their equipment for the descent, the reality of their situation became impossible to ignore. They were about to enter the heart of a biological network that had been designed by intelligence far exceeding human capabilities, armed with technology they barely understood, racing against time to prevent not just their own deaths, but the elimination of everything they'd spent their lives building and protecting. The descent into the cave system began with a natural limestone passage that gradually transformed into something altogether more unsettling. What had started as familiar Pacific Northwest geology weathered rock formations carved by centuries of underground water flow evolved into tunnels that showed signs of deliberate modification. Jake led the way with his spelunking experience, testing each foothold and anchoring their safety ropes with practiced efficiency. Behind him, Elise carried the frequency generator components in a specialized backpack, while Martha brought up the rear with their medical supplies and emergency equipment. "These walls aren't natural," Jake called softly, running his hands along the tunnel surface. "Look at how smooth they are, how uniform the dimensions remain even as we change elevation. Something's been working to maintain these passages." The isolation chamber they'd prepared at the clinic seemed like a distant memory compared to the reality of moving through tunnels that were clearly inhabited by the very organisms they were trying to eliminate. Every shadow could conceal a parasitic colony. Every sound could signal the approach of infected hosts, and every breath of the humid underground air carried the possibility of contamination. Elise checked her father's map coordinates against their current position, noting how accurately his surveys had predicted the tunnel layout and directional changes. His years of preparation were proving invaluable, but they also raised questions about how he'd obtained such detailed knowledge of a cave system that official geological surveys had never fully documented. "Martha, how are you holding up?" she asked during a brief rest stop, noticing that their older companion was breathing heavily despite her obvious determination to continue. "I'm fine, honey. Just thinking about what my grandmother would say if she could see us now." Martha adjusted her headlamp and consulted her water bottle with the practical efficiency that had made her indispensable at the clinic. She always said, "The women in our family were too stubborn to know when to quit," and I suppose this proves her point. They resumed their descent, following Jake's careful navigation through increasingly complex tunnel networks. The air grew warmer as they went deeper, carrying scents that didn't belong in any natural cave system, organic compounds that suggested active biological processes, and underlying chemical signatures that made Elise think of hospital corridors and laboratory environments. After 2 hours of steady progress, they encountered their first direct evidence of parasitic activity. Jake stopped abruptly, holding up his hand for silence, and directed their lights toward a section of tunnel wall that appeared to be moving. The surface was covered with organisms similar to the creature they'd extracted from the stray dog, but these specimens were clearly more developed. They moved in coordinated patterns across the rock face, their mandibles clicking in rhythmic sequences that created an almost musical effect in the confined space. "They're communicating," Elise whispered, remembering her father's notes about ultrasonic frequency coordination. This might be one of the relay stations he documented, a location where the organisms amplify and redistribute signals throughout the network. Jake studied the creature's behavior with the analytical eye of someone who'd spent years observing animal patterns in their natural habitat. They know we're here, but they're not showing aggressive behavior. It's like they're reporting our presence rather than trying to stop us. That observation carried disturbing implications about the intelligence directing the parasitic network. If the organisms were capable of strategic thinking, allowing potential threats to penetrate deeper into the cave system rather than eliminating them at the earliest opportunity, then they were dealing with an enemy far more sophisticated than anything her father's research had suggested. They moved past the relay station with careful attention to maintaining silence and minimal light exposure, but Elise couldn't shake the feeling that they were being observed and evaluated rather than simply avoided. The creature's apparent lack of concern about their presence suggested either supreme confidence in their defensive capabilities or a deliberate strategy to lure intruders toward a location where they could be dealt with more effectively. The tunnel system branched repeatedly as they descended, requiring frequent consultation of her father's maps to maintain their course toward the primary colony nexus. Each decision point brought the possibility of wrong turns that could lead them into dead ends or areas where the parasitic concentration made survival unlikely. "Dr. Garner," Jake said during another rest stop, "I've been thinking about the timeline your father documented. If these outbreaks happen every 25 years or so, and if the organisms are as sophisticated as his research suggests, why haven't they simply expanded beyond small town containment zones?" It was a question that had been troubling Elise since discovering her father's historical documentation. "I think they're not trying to achieve global dominance. They're conducting experiments. Each outbreak tests different variables: environmental conditions, population densities, genetic targets, containment responses. They're learning about human capabilities and vulnerabilities." Martha paused in organizing their medical supplies, her expression shifting from determination to genuine fear. "So we're not just fighting for Cedar Falls. We're fighting to prevent them from perfecting their methods for larger-scale deployment." The weight of that realization settled over them as they continued deeper into the cave system. They weren't just trying to save their community. They were potentially humanity's first line of defense against a biological warfare program that had been running field tests for decades. The frequency generator components felt heavier as Elise adjusted her backpack, thinking about her father's warnings that the device represented their only hope of disrupting the parasitic network. But using it effectively would require getting close enough to the queen organism to deliver a concentrated ultrasonic pulse. And there was no guarantee that the technology would work as designed against creatures that had clearly evolved beyond his original research parameters. Jake's radio crackled with fragments of transmission from the surface, where government agents were apparently coordinating expanded perimeter operations. The few words they could understand suggested that their absence from the clinic had been noticed, and that search teams were being deployed to locate what officials were describing as potentially infected civilians who pose a containment risk. "They're not looking for us to provide medical assistance," Martha observed grimly. "They're hunting us because we know too much about what's really happening." As they approached the final section of tunnel leading to the colony nexus, the environmental conditions became increasingly hostile. The air grew thick with organic compounds that made breathing difficult. The walls showed evidence of extensive parasitic colonization, and the sound of coordinated movement echoed from passages that branched away into darkness. According to her father's maps, they were less than half a mile from the queen organism's reproductive chamber, the heart of the network that was coordinating the systematic infection of Cedar Falls and potentially preparing for expansion to other communities. But they were also entering territory where the parasitic concentration made discovery almost inevitable, where a single wrong turn could lead them into defensive positions that had been prepared specifically to eliminate intruders, and where the failure of their mission would guarantee not just their own deaths, but the successful completion of an experimental program that threatened far more than one small Oregon town. Elise checked the frequency generator one final time, reviewing her father's technical specifications and hoping that his years of preparation had been sufficient to provide them with the tools they needed to fight back against an enemy that had been planning this confrontation for far longer than any of them had realized. The final transmission from Dr. Chun reached them through Jake's portable radio just as they approached the entrance to the Queen's chamber. Static-filled and fragmented, her voice carried an urgency that made them pause their careful advance through the increasingly hostile tunnel environment. DNA analysis complete, organisms specifically engineered targeting. Garner family genetic markers, not random infestation. Repeat. This is targeted elimination. The transmission cut to static, but the implications hit Elise with devastating clarity. Her father hadn't been studying random parasitic outbreaks for decades. He'd been tracking a systematic campaign designed to eliminate their bloodline. Every town, every outbreak, every carefully documented incident had involved members of the Garner family or their direct descendants. Jake looked at her with growing understanding. That's why your father moved to Cedar Falls. He wasn't just researching the organisms. He was positioning himself at the next target location. Martha stopped organizing their medical supplies, her face pale in the harsh LED lighting. Honey, what Jake's saying, your father knew this was coming here because he knew they were hunting your family specifically. Elise pulled out her father's research notes, scanning them with new comprehension of their true purpose. The genetic markers he'd documented, the family trees he'd traced, the migration patterns he'd studied, all of it had been preparation for a targeted biological attack that had been planned and executed across multiple generations. But why? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Why would anyone design a biological weapon to eliminate specific family lines? The answer came from an unexpected source, a voice emerging from the shadows of the tunnel ahead of them, speaking with the calm authority of someone who'd been waiting for this conversation for a very long time. Because your family represents a threat to the most successful biological warfare program in human history. Dr. Raymond Garner stepped into their circle of light, looking exactly as Elise remembered him, but carrying equipment that suggested he'd been living underground for far longer than anyone had realized. His clothes were adapted for extended cave exploration. His gear was military-grade rather than academic, and his eyes held the focused intensity of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for years. Dad? Elise's voice caught between shock and relief. I thought your phone was disconnected, your cabin was abandoned. All necessary deceptions to maintain the illusion that I was no longer a factor in their calculations. Raymond moved closer, studying their group with approval, tempered by concern about their presence in such dangerous territory. I've been monitoring their surveillance operations for months, waiting for the right moment to act. Jake kept his hand near his radio, clearly uncertain whether this reunion represented salvation or additional danger. Dr. Garner, who exactly is they? Who's been targeting your family? Raymond settled onto a rock formation that had clearly been arranged as a temporary observation post, spreading out maps and equipment that revealed the true scope of his underground operations. The parasitic organisms are biological weapons developed by a consortium of private, military contractors and government agencies that have been operating outside official oversight for decades. But they're not weapons of mass destruction. They're weapons of precise elimination. He pulled out a tablet displaying genetic analysis data that made Elise's veterinary training seem primitive by comparison. The Garner family carries specific DNA sequences that make us immune to standard biological weapons, while simultaneously making us extremely vulnerable to targeted parasitic infections. What would they call genetic threats? People whose natural resistance to conventional biological warfare makes us dangerous to their strategic capabilities. Martha leaned forward, her practical nursing background helping her process the technical information. So they've been eliminating people who might survive other types of biological attacks? More than that, they've been eliminating people whose genetic resistance might be passed on to future generations, creating populations that would be impossible to control through conventional biological warfare. Raymond's voice carried the weight of years spent understanding the scope of what they were fighting. The Garner family isn't the only target. There are dozens of genetic lines that have been systematically eliminated over the past century. Elise felt the pieces of her father's research clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The historical outbreaks, the town eliminations, the cover-ups, it's all been preparation for larger-scale deployment of biological weapons against populations that have been genetically cleansed of resistant bloodlines. Exactly. Cedar Falls was chosen as a test site not because of its geographic isolation, but because I moved here. They've been using my research to perfect their targeting mechanisms while simultaneously eliminating the threat I represent to their program. Jake's radio crackled with transmission fragments that suggested increased surface activity. Dr. Garner, how much time do we have before they implement their sterilization protocols? Raymond checked a sophisticated monitoring device that was tracking ultrasonic frequencies throughout the cave system. The queen organism is entering her reproductive cycle ahead of schedule, probably triggered by the stress of our presence in her territory. We have maybe 2 hours before she begins producing offspring that will be resistant to the frequency disruption technology. He led them deeper into the tunnel system, moving with the confidence of someone who'd spent months mapping every passage and defensive position. The frequency generator will work, but only if we can deliver the pulse during a specific window when the queen is most vulnerable. Miss that window, and the next generation of organisms will be immune to ultrasonic interference. As they approached the entrance to the queen's chamber, Elise realized that her father had been preparing for this confrontation, not just as a scientist studying parasitic organisms, but as a soldier fighting a war that most of humanity didn't even know was being waged. "Dad, there's something I need to ask you." She paused their advance, needing to understand the full scope of what they were attempting. If we succeed in disrupting this colony, what happens to the larger program? Do we stop the entire biological warfare operation, or do we just delay it? Raymond's expression grew grim as he considered the strategic implications of their mission. We stop this phase of the program and buy time for other resistance networks to act. But Elise, you need to understand success here means becoming a permanent target. They'll never stop hunting us, and they'll never stop trying to eliminate genetic lines that threaten their capabilities. Martha gathered their medical supplies with renewed determination, her voice steady despite the enormity of what they'd learned. Then, we better make sure we succeed, because hiding from something like this isn't living. It's just dying slowly. The entrance to the Queen's chamber appeared ahead of them, marked by environmental conditions that made the previous tunnel sections seem hospitable by comparison. The air was thick with organic compounds that made breathing difficult. The walls pulsed with bioluminescent organisms that created shifting patterns of light and shadow. And the sound of coordinated movement suggested a level of parasitic activity that defied anything in conventional biological research. But it was the realization of what they were truly fighting, not just for their own survival or even for Cedar Falls, but for the preservation of human genetic diversity against a via systematic elimination program that gave their mission its ultimate significance. "Jake, Martha," Raymond said as they prepared their equipment for the final assault, "I need you to understand what we're about to attempt. Will make us enemies of forces that have been operating with impunity for decades. If you want to turn back, now is your last chance." Jake checked his radio one final time, confirming that surface communications were completely blocked. "Dr. Garner, I've lived in Cedar Falls my whole life. These people are neighbors, are friends. They're worth fighting for regardless of the consequences. Martha secured her medical kit and checked her flashlight batteries with the methodical efficiency that had made her invaluable in countless medical emergencies. Besides, someone needs to be around to patch you all up when this goes wrong. And I'm the best medic you're going to find in the middle of a cave system. As they prepared to enter the Queen's chamber, Elise felt the weight of her father's research, her community's trust, and humanity's future pressing down on her with crushing intensity. But she also felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, fighting alongside people who would risk everything to protect what they loved most. The frequency generator assembly required precise calibration that could only be completed in proximity to the queen organism's reproductive chamber. Raymond worked with practiced efficiency, connecting components while Elise monitored the devices. Readings against specifications she was beginning to understand represented years of theoretical research finally put into practical application. The ultrasonic pulse needs to be delivered at exactly the right frequency to disrupt the Queen's neural coordination network, Raymond explained, adjusting sensitive electronic components with the delicate touch of someone who understood that a single miscalibration could render their entire mission futile. Too high, and will only irritate her. Too low, and we might actually enhance her reproductive capabilities. Jake positioned himself at the chamber entrance, using his spelunking experience to assess the tactical challenges they would face once they committed to the assault. The passage ahead opened into a cavern whose dimensions exceeded anything on Raymond's maps, with acoustics that suggested both vast open space and complex internal structures. Dr. Garner, the sound patterns coming from in there, they're not just random biological noise. There's rhythm, coordination, almost like music. Jake paused his reconnaissance, his expression troubled by what he was observing. Whatever's directing. Activity in that chamber has intelligence that goes way beyond instinctual behavior. Martha had arranged their medical supplies with military precision, creating treatment stations for injuries she hoped they wouldn't sustain, but was determined to be prepared for. Her practical nursing experience had taught her that the best medical interventions were the ones planned before they were needed. I've got field dressings for puncture wounds, antibiotics for infections, and pain medication for trauma injuries, she reported. But honey, if those organisms get into our bloodstream, I don't have anything that's going to help with that kind of contamination. Raymond paused his work on the frequency generator, meeting each team member's eyes with the gravity of someone who'd spent years understanding the stakes of their mission. Martha's right about the contamination risk. If any of us gets infected during the assault, we can't return to the surface. The parasitic network would use our genetic information to enhance their targeting capabilities. The weight of that revelation settled over them as they completed their final preparations. They weren't just risking their lives. They were accepting that success might require ultimate sacrifice to prevent the biological warfare program from acquiring enhanced capabilities. Elise studied her father's technical documentation one final time, memorizing the precise sequence of steps required to activate the frequency generator under combat conditions. The device represented not just advanced technology, but years of her father's life spent preparing for a confrontation he'd hoped would never be necessary. Dad, I need to understand something about the timing, she said, checking the chronometer. That would coordinate their assault with the Queen's reproductive cycle. You've been monitoring her biological rhythms for months. How certain are you about the vulnerability window? Raymond consulted readings from sensors he'd placed throughout the cave system during his extended underground reconnaissance. The Queen enters peak reproductive activity every 28 days, with maximum vulnerability lasting approximately 45 minutes. During that window, her neural coordination capabilities are focused on offspring production rather than colony defense. Jake moved back from his reconnaissance position, his expression carrying news that complicated their tactical situation. "We've got movement in the secondary tunnels. Infected hosts are converging on the chamber from multiple directions. It looks like the Queen's calling in defensive reinforcements." Through the chamber entrance, they could see evidence of the coordinated response Jake had detected. Infected animals moved through the cavern with purposeful efficiency, positioning themselves around what appeared to be elevated platforms surrounding a central organic structure that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. "She knows we're here," Martha observed, watching the defensive preparations with the analytical eye of someone who'd spent decades managing medical emergencies. "Question is whether she's responding to our presence specifically, or whether this is standard reproductive cycle protection behavior." Raymond activated monitoring equipment that displayed the ultrasonic frequency patterns emanating from the Queen's chamber. The readings showed complex communication signals coordinating activity throughout the parasitic network, not just locally, but extending to infected hosts across the entire Cedar Falls area. "It's both," he said, studying the frequency analysis with growing concern. "She's implementing standard reproductive defenses, but she's also coordinating with surface colonies to track our movements and predict our capabilities. The level of strategic thinking we're seeing here is unprecedented." The realization that they were facing an enemy capable of real-time tactical adaptation forced them to reconsider their approach. The frequency generator would work, but only if they could deliver the pulse before the Queen's defensive preparations neutralized their technological advantage. "Dr. Garner," Jake said, "what if we created a diversion to split her attention between reproductive activities and defensive coordination? Something that would force her to choose between protecting her offspring and protecting herself." Raymond considered the tactical implications while continuing his frequency generator calibrations. It could work, but the diversion would need to be significant enough to register as a genuine threat to the colony's survival. Martha pulled out the emergency flares she'd included in their medical supplies, her expression showing the kind of practical problem-solving that had made her invaluable during countless clinical crises. "What about using these to create multiple light sources throughout the chamber? The organisms we've seen so far seem to prefer low-light conditions. Sudden, bright illumination might trigger emergency responses that would interfere with their coordination." As they refined their tactical approach, Elise found herself thinking about the broader implications of their mission. If they succeeded in destroying the Queen and disrupting the local parasitic network, they would be striking a blow against a biological warfare program that had been operating with impunity for decades. But they would also be marking themselves as permanent enemies of forces that had demonstrated the capability to eliminate entire communities without public acknowledgement. "Dad, after tonight, assuming we survive, what kind of life are we going to have? How do you live knowing that there are people out there with the resources to engineer biological weapons specifically designed to kill you?" Raymond's expression reflected years of grappling with exactly that question. "You live by building networks of resistance, by sharing information with other genetic targets, and by never allowing them to operate in complete secrecy. The biological warfare program depends on maintaining plausible deniability. The more people who know about their activities, the harder it becomes for them to implement large-scale operations." Jake's radio picked up fragments of surface transmission that suggested the government containment teams were becoming increasingly aggressive in their search efforts. References to potentially infected civilians and immediate threat neutralization left little doubt about their intentions if they located the missing veterinary team. "They're not planning to take us into custody for medical evaluation," Jake observed grimly. "They're planning to eliminate us as security risks." The frequency generator completed its calibration sequence with a soft electronic chime that seemed remarkably peaceful given the circumstances. Raymond ran through final diagnostics while Elise familiarized herself with the device's operational controls, understanding that she might need to activate it under conditions that wouldn't allow for careful technical review. The device is designed to deliver a concentrated ultrasonic pulse that will disrupt the Queen's neural coordination network, Raymond explained, showing her the targeting mechanism and activation sequence. But it has to be positioned within 30 meters of her central nervous system to be effective. 30 meters meant getting close enough to the Queen organism to see her clearly, to observe the biological processes that were coordinating the systematic infection of their community, and to witness firsthand the intelligence behind a parasitic network that had been designed specifically to eliminate people like them. Martha checked her watch, correlating their timeline with the biological rhythms Raymond had been monitoring. According to your calculations, we've got 20 minutes until the vulnerability window opens. After that, we've got 45 minutes to complete the mission before she becomes resistant to ultrasonic interference. As they prepared to enter the Queen's chamber, Elise realized that everything in her life had been leading to this moment: her veterinary training, her estrangement from her father, her return to Cedar Falls, and her discovery of the parasitic threat. She was exactly where she needed to be, with exactly the right people, carrying exactly the tools necessary to fight back against forces that had spent decades believing they could eliminate genetic threats without consequences. The entrance, too. The chamber loomed before them, beyond which waited an enemy that represented the convergence of advanced biological engineering, systematic genetic targeting, and organizational resources that spanned multiple government agencies. But they also carried the accumulated wisdom of years of preparation, the determination of people fighting for their community's survival, and the technological capability to strike a decisive blow against a program that had operated in shadows for far too long. Everyone ready? Raymond asked, shouldering his equipment pack and checking the frequency generator's portable power supply. Jake secured his radio and lighting equipment, his expression showing the focused determination of someone who'd made peace with the risks they were accepting. Let's go save our town. Martha gathered her medical supplies and emergency equipment, her voice carrying the steady confidence that had sustained countless patients through their worst moments. Let's go save a lot more than that. As they stepped into the Queen's chamber, Elise felt the weight of history settling around them. Not just the history of their own community, but the hidden history of biological warfare programs, genetic targeting operations, and systematic elimination campaigns that had been shaping human evolution from the shadows. Tonight, in a cave beneath a small Oregon town, that shadow war was finally going to be fought in the open. The Queen's chamber was a biological cathedral that defied every assumption Elise had made about parasitic organisms and their capabilities. The cavern stretched upward into darkness beyond their lighting range, its walls covered with bioluminescent networks that pulsed in coordinated patterns, creating an environment that was simultaneously alien and hauntingly beautiful. At the chamber's center, the Queen organism dominated a raised platform that had been constructed from what appeared to be organic building material secreted by the parasitic network over months or years of preparation. She was massive, easily 15 feet in length, with a segmented body that incorporated features from multiple species in ways that suggested deliberate biological engineering rather than natural evolution. But it was her intelligence that truly unsettled them. As they entered the chamber, the Queen's compound eyes tracked their movement with obvious awareness, and the ultrasonic frequencies emanating from her central nervous system shifted to patterns that clearly represented communication, rather than simple biological function. "She's talking to the defensive hosts," Raymond whispered, monitoring the frequency generator's readings as infected animals positioned themselves around the chamber's perimeter, coordinating their positions based on our capabilities and likely tactical approaches. Jake deployed Martha's emergency flares around the chamber's entrance, creating pools of bright illumination that triggered immediate responses from the parasitic network. Infected hosts recoiled from the sudden light, their coordinated movements disrupted by sensory overload that interfered with their ultrasonic communication capabilities. "It's working," he reported, watching defensive positions collapse as infected. Animals struggled to maintain coordination in the altered lighting conditions. But she's adapting. Look at how quickly she's reorganizing her defenses. The queen organism was indeed demonstrating tactical flexibility that exceeded anything. In Raymond's research, within minutes of the flare deployment, she had shifted her defensive coordination to visual signals, using bioluminescent patterns on her body surface to direct infected hosts toward new positions to minimize their exposure to the disruptive lighting. Martha established their medical station behind a rock formation that provided cover from the chamber's primary sightlines while maintaining access to retreat routes if their assault failed. How much time until the vulnerability window opens? Raymond checked his chronometer against the biological rhythm data he'd been collecting. 8 minutes until she enters peak reproductive activity. That's when her neural coordination capabilities will be focused on offspring production rather than defensive planning. Elise positioned the frequency generator according to her father's specifications, but the device's targeting systems were registering interference from the chamber's complex acoustic environment. The queen's ultrasonic communication patterns were creating echo effects that made precise frequency delivery more challenging than the laboratory conditions Raymond had used for his original calibrations. Dad, the targeting system isn't getting a clear lock on her central nervous system. There's too much acoustic interference from her communication with the defensive hosts. Before Raymond could respond, the queen's reproductive cycle began with a biological display that was both magnificent and terrifying. Her body segments expanded and contracted in rhythmic patterns that triggered corresponding responses throughout the chamber as infected hosts moved to positions that would protect the offspring production process. But the queen's vulnerability window also revealed the true scope of what they were fighting. As her neural coordination capability shifted toward reproduction, the chamber filled with evidence of the parasitic network's long-term planning. Organic structures that had appeared decorative revealed themselves as sophisticated breeding facilities, and the infected hosts positioned themselves not just for defense, but for nurturing and protecting the next generation of organisms. "Elise, you need to activate the frequency generator now," Raymond urged, watching readings that showed the queen's defensive capabilities diminishing as her biological processes focused on reproduction. "This is our window. She's as vulnerable as she's going to get." Jake moved closer to the queen's platform, using his climbing experience to position himself where he could observe her central nervous system directly. "Dr. Garner, I think I can." "Get close enough to provide manual targeting assistance. The frequency generator needs line-of-sight contact with her primary neural cluster." "Jake, no. The contamination risk is too high if you get within her defensive range." But Jake was already moving, using rock formations and shadows to approach the queen's platform while her attention was focused on reproductive activities. His progress was methodical and careful, drawing on years of experience navigating challenging cave environments under dangerous conditions. The queen's awareness of his approach became obvious when her bioluminescent patterns shifted to warning configurations, but her reproductive cycle prevented her from implementing the coordinated defensive response she would normally have used to eliminate intruders. "I'm in position," Jake called softly, establishing visual contact with the queen's central nervous system. "The primary neural cluster is exposed during the reproductive cycle. I can see the targeting point the frequency generator needs to hit." Martha monitored their communication frequencies while maintaining watch for surface interference or additional infected hosts entering the chamber. "Jake, honey, You need to be very careful about exposure to reproductive secretions. We don't know what kind of contamination effects they might have. As the queen's reproductive cycle reached peak intensity, Elise realized that their success depended on perfect coordination between the frequency generators, technical capabilities, and Jake's ability to provide real-time targeting information, under conditions that made precise communication almost impossible. The fate of Cedar Falls, and potentially the future of human genetic diversity, was balanced on a moment of technological precision delivered in one of the most hostile biological environments any of them had ever encountered. The frequency generator's targeting system achieved lock just as Jake's position became untenable. The queen organism, despite her reproductive vulnerability, had begun secreting defensive compounds that created a toxic atmosphere around her. Platform, a final biological safeguard that would eliminate any threats that managed to penetrate her outer defenses. "Jake, get out of there," Martha called, watching their young companion struggle with respiratory distress caused by exposure to the queen's chemical defenses. "The contamination levels are beyond anything we can treat." But Jake maintained his position long enough to provide the precise targeting coordinates the frequency generator required. "Dr. Garner, you have a clear shot at her primary neural cluster. Activate the device now." Raymond's sacrifice protocol became clear as he handed Elise the frequency generator's activation controls. Years of research had revealed that destroying the queen would require someone to maintain targeting precision throughout the entire ultrasonic pulse sequence, a process that would expose the operator to lethal levels of parasitic contamination. "Elise, I need you to understand something that I couldn't tell you before," he said, checking readings that showed the queen's reproductive cycle approaching its most vulnerable phase. "The frequency generator works, but operating it at this range means certain infection. I've been preparing for this moment for years." The truth hit her with devastating clarity. Her father hadn't been preparing to survive this confrontation. He'd been preparing to ensure its success at the cost of his own life. The years of isolation, the advanced preparations, the sophisticated equipment, all of it had been designed around a mission he'd never expected to survive. "Dad, no. There has to be another way. We can modify the targeting system, extend the range, find a solution that doesn't require. There's no time, and there's no alternative." Raymond began the activation sequence with hands that were steady, despite the magnitude of what he was accepting. "But you need to know that stopping this queen doesn't end the biological warfare program. It only delays it. You'll need to continue the fight, coordinate with other resistance networks, and ensure that what we've learned here reaches people who can act on it." Jake began his retreat from the queen's platform, moving with difficulty through an atmosphere that was becoming increasingly toxic. The defensive compounds the queen was secreting weren't just chemical weapons, they were biological agents designed to break down genetic resistance and make targets more susceptible to parasitic infection. "Jake's showing signs of exposure," Martha reported, monitoring his condition while maintaining their defensive positions. "Respiratory distress, skin irritation, and what looks like the beginning stages of parasitic infection." The frequency generator reached full power as the queen's reproductive cycle hit peak vulnerability. Raymond maintained precise targeting, despite exposure to toxic atmospheric conditions that should have incapacitated him within minutes. His years of gradual exposure to parasitic organisms had built up resistance levels that allowed him to function in environments that would have killed anyone else. "Elise, when the pulse activates, the queen's death will trigger defensive responses throughout the parasitic network," he explained, his voice already showing signs of respiratory compromise. "You'll have approximately 10 minutes to evacuate the cave system before the remaining organisms implement scorched earth protocols." The ultrasonic pulse began with a sound that was felt rather than heard, a vibration that seemed to penetrate every surface in the chamber and interfere with the biological rhythms that coordinated the parasitic network. The queen's response was immediate and dramatic, her massive body convulsing as the frequency disruption attacked her central nervous system. But the pulse also triggered exactly the response Raymond had predicted. Infected hosts throughout the chamber began moving toward the frequency generator with coordinated aggression that suggested the queen's final command was the elimination of whoever was responsible for the attack. "Martha, Jake, head for the exit now," Elise shouted, realizing that her father's sacrifice was creating the window they needed to escape. But only if they moved immediately. Jake struggled toward their position, his condition deteriorating rapidly. As the parasitic infection spread through his system, Martha intercepted him with emergency medical supplies, applying treatments that might slow the infection's progress but couldn't reverse the contamination he'd sustained. "Dr. Garner, the targeting system is losing lock," Raymond called, his ability to maintain precise frequency delivery compromised by advancing infection symptoms. "You need to take over the controls and maintain the pulse until the queen's neural network is completely disrupted." Elise moved toward the frequency generator, understanding that completing her father's mission would mean accepting the same contamination that was killing him. But Jake's sacrifice had provided the targeting coordinates they needed, and Martha's medical expertise was keeping him functional long enough to coordinate their evacuation. "Dad, no goodbyes, just action. Complete the mission, save our town, and make sure this research reaches people who can stop the larger program." As the queen's death throes shook the entire chamber and infected hosts converged on their position with desperate fury, Elise took control of the frequency generator and maintained the pulse that would destroy the parasitic network's coordination. The cost of victory was becoming clear, but so was the necessity of paying it. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Dr. Elise Garner stood in the memorial garden that had been established where her father's veterinary research facility once operated. The community of Cedar Falls had insisted on creating this space, not just to honor Raymond Garner's sacrifice, but to ensure that future generations would understand the price of the freedom they now enjoyed. Jake Morrison approached across the carefully tended grounds, moving with only a slight reminder of the respiratory difficulties he'd sustained during their underground confrontation. His recovery had been remarkable, aided by treatments developed from Raymond's research notes and by his own stubborn determination to rebuild the life that had nearly been taken from him. The federal investigators finished their final interviews yesterday, he said, settling onto the bench beside Elise with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd shared experiences that created unbreakable bonds. "They're still not happy about our refusal to discuss certain details, but they've accepted that the official report will focus on industrial contamination and successful emergency response protocols." The cover story had required careful coordination between multiple agencies, none of whom wanted public acknowledgement of biological warfare programs that had been operating without oversight for decades. Cedar Falls had become the test case for a new approach. Communities that successfully resisted covert biological attacks would be protected from retaliation, but only if they maintained plausible deniability about what had actually occurred. Martha Fleming joined them in the garden, carrying fresh flowers for the memorial stone and the satisfied expression of someone who'd successfully managed another complex logistical challenge. At 63, she'd adapted to her new role as coordinator for the underground resistance network with the same practical efficiency she'd brought to managing the veterinary clinic. The Portland team confirmed that the frequency generator specifications are being distributed to 12 other target communities, she reported, arranging flowers with the care she'd once reserved for organizing medical supplies. And the genetic resistance testing program is expanding to include families in Washington, California, and northern Idaho. The resistance network that had grown from Raymond's research now spanned multiple states, connecting individuals and communities that had been marked for elimination by the biological warfare program. The technology developed for their confrontation with the Cedar Falls queen had been adapted for broader deployment, creating defensive capabilities that could protect other genetic targets from similar attacks. Elise opened the leather-bound journal she'd been maintaining since their return to the surface. Not a medical record this time, but a comprehensive documentation of everything they'd learned about parasitic warfare, genetic targeting, and community-resistance strategies. The journal would eventually join a growing archive of information that was being shared among resistance cells and academic researchers who could be trusted with sensitive knowledge. Dr. Chun's latest analysis confirms that we completely eliminated the local parasitic network, she said, reviewing entries that documented the systematic recovery of Cedar Falls' animal population. No infected hosts, no residual organisms, and no evidence of reproductive capability in any specimens we've tested. The success of their mission had created ripple effects throughout the biological warfare community that went far beyond the elimination of a single queen organism. For the first time in decades, a targeted community had not only survived an engineered parasitic attack, but had documented the process and shared their defensive strategies with other potential targets. Jake's radio monitoring station, now permanently installed in the Memorial Garden, maintained contact with resistance networks across the Pacific Northwest. The equipment served both practical and symbolic purposes, ensuring that Cedar Falls would never again be isolated during a biological emergency, while demonstrating the community's commitment to supporting other towns facing similar threats. The communication protocols are working better than we'd hoped, Jake said, adjusting frequency settings that maintained encrypted contact with 12 other communities. Early warning systems, resource sharing, coordinated research efforts. We're building the kind of network that makes large-scale biological attacks much more difficult to implement. The memorial stone bore a simple inscription that captured both the personal loss and the broader significance of their struggle. Raymond Garner, 1952 to 2024. Scientist, father, defender of human genetic diversity. His research continues, but the Memorial Garden represented more than remembrance. It served as headquarters for ongoing resistance activities that honored Raymond's sacrifice by ensuring his work achieved its ultimate purpose. The small building housed communication, equipment, research facilities, and meeting spaces for coordination between resistance cells. Elise thought about the conversation she'd had with her father during their final moments together in the Queen's chamber. His warnings about the biological warfare program's scope and persistence had proven accurate. The elimination of the Cedar Falls colony had triggered increased surveillance and more sophisticated targeting of resistance networks. We've got 3 new communities requesting consultation about suspicious animal behavior patterns, Martha said, checking messages from the secure communication network. All in areas where families with genetic resistance markers have recently relocated. The pattern was becoming clear. The biological warfare program was adapting its strategies in response to the resistance network's success, focusing on smaller, more isolated attacks that would be harder to detect and counter. But the resistance was adapting too, developing rapid response capabilities and sharing defensive technologies that made each subsequent attack more difficult to implement successfully. As evening settled over Cedar Falls, Elise realized that her father's prediction about the life they would lead after their confrontation had been both accurate and incomplete. They were indeed permanent enemies of forces with vast resources and sophisticated capabilities, but they were no longer fighting alone. The Memorial Garden filled with the peaceful sounds of a community that had survived an impossible threat and emerged stronger for the experience. Children played among the carefully tended plants while their parents discussed the subtle changes that had made Cedar Falls a safer, more resilient place to live. Jake's radio crackled with a transmission from the Seattle Resistance Cell. reporting successful identification and elimination of a parasitic colony before it could reach reproductive maturity. The frequency generator technology, developed from Raymond's research, had proven effective in preventing attacks before they could threaten community survival. "Another one stopped," Jake said with quiet satisfaction. "That makes 7 successful preventive interventions this quarter." Martha gathered her gardening tools and prepared to lock up the memorial building, her expression showing the deep contentment of someone whose life's work had evolved into something larger and more meaningful than she'd ever imagined possible. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, the question carrying implications about ongoing resistance activities that went far beyond memorial garden maintenance. "Same time tomorrow," Elise confirmed, closing her journal and looking up at the stars that were becoming visible in the darkening sky. The fight continued, but they were no longer fighting it in isolation. And somewhere in the vast network of communities, families, and individuals who've been marked for elimination, Raymond Garner's research was providing tools for survival and hope for a future where human genetic diversity would be protected rather than systematically destroyed.